Hello, welcome once again to From Caracas. I'm Laura Prada, and in this opportunity we'll be talking to Meyby Ugueto-Ponce, who is an anthropologist, researcher, and an Afro-Venezuelan woman who will take us through Afro-Latin American culture. Welcome, Meyby.
Thank you.
Hi, Laura.
Meyby, what is Afro-Venezuelan culture?
The first thing we need to specify is the term Afro-Venezuelan, which was coined approximately in the decade of the 1940s by a native person from Curiepe, an Afro-Venezuelan named Juan Pablo Sojo, who did his research and to denote what he was seeing in his own communities and neighboring communities, used the term Afro-Venezuelan instead of using the word black, which is the word that is generally used to talk about the communities, the culture and constructions of African descendants, who came forced from the African continent in the slave context and transatlantic trafficking. Then, when we talk about Afro-Venezolanity, we are referring to cultures that are built, that are recreated after the slave trade from the 1492 in the American continent, and the mixture, the cultural appropriation in selective terms of the ecological, the religious, with different human groups, both indigenous, of different spaces and different regions as European groups and different African regions. Then it is a cultural recreation that occurs after the forced migration of African to America in American spaces.
Former President Hugo Chavez was the first Sambo in Venezuela in Venezuelan history to become a powerful politician. Sambo is known in Venezuela as the mixtures between Latin American mixed with indigenous and African. How can it be possible that some professions are restricted to some people, specifically white people, or like politics, and some others are just for black persons, like, I don't know, maybe sports?
There is a debate that still needs to be emphasized and argued, which has to do with the racial division of work, which basically the structure of society is organized by an ethnic or cultural reference in addition to the idea of classes, which were very early before even of the European national state, is erected under this social pyramid that consolidates populations of ethnic groups different from the Europeans at the base of the pyramid, and the ideologies that are being formed for these republics also perpetuate this social, political, and economic structure. Of course, then the construction of citizenship, of equality, of rights, of opportunities is thought in function of this Creole nation or mestizo to which it is considered an ideal, and the opportunities towards education are diminished according to this purity of blood, as for example could be said for the United States, for this whitening. Then I can characterize that as Barlovento, an area located in the north of the country, where the first university, for instance, the first institute of third level is created at the end of the last century, around the 80s of the last century. Then, if there is a preponderance in the spaces of concentration of Afrodescendant population, where the educational opportunities, for example, are not the same as in other places of the country in territorial terms, of course, that the access to the education, in this case, of third level, will be more restricted to these people, because there must be mobility or uprooting to be able to access this right of citizen. The possibility of being doctors, of being engineers, of training as psychologists, as lawyers, will always be at a disadvantage with other Venezuelans who are in other territorial spaces where there is no Afro-Venezuelan concentration. Then it is limited on the ideas that were built from the colony on the black, on the Afro as strong, the animality associated with the slavery, the excessive hypersexualization of the woman and the black man as strong, not intellectually speaking. I mean, the contribution is not intellectual, but physical. Then the sport is a space where Afros are probably more successful than in careers as a medicine. Then there is a colonial logic that follows and traversalizes the republic and is expressed in institutions and the way in which citizenship and equal rights are accessed. So we see how there is a preponderance of professionals in areas such as medicine, engineering, that has changed, of course, in the case of Venezuela for social mobility and crossbreeding. But there is preponderance in fourth-level studies, for example, of population or white-skinned people and higher social classes.
Can we speak then of racial democracy in Venezuela?
No, I don't think so. We believe or exists the myth of racial democracy based on the strong ideology of crossbreeding that is built from the formation of the republic. That is, the entire American continent needed to unify the popular mass, all the ethnic and cultural components that they had in the internal of their nations, to create an ideological instrument that would allow the idea of unity. And that became the concept of crossbreeding, that although biological and culturally is a process that is given in a natural way, rather than is given in the American context by the colonial situation. There was not necessarily opportunity or conditions for that equality would materialize. Then, that ideal is strengthened in the imaginary, in the subjectivities of the citizens and in the constitutional projects, thinking that the ideal of equality had reached it. Then we would have to ask, equal to who? Nobody knows exactly who we are going to be equal to, but deep down we know that there is an ideal towards the greatest possible whitening, towards the Creole idea that was the elite group that held power. This generates that in Venezuela all the processes of incorporation and social inclusion tend towards the individuals. Men and women go towards the whitening, both physical, cultural and ideological. Then always there are very clear examples in terms of the annulment of Afro-being. The indigenous issues also, but I will confine myself to the Afro theme in terms of the epistemicide of knowledge, that is, how knowledge is increasingly diminished or underestimated because what is important, what has more value, is a culture that builds the white, or what comes from the outside, or in aesthetic terms, the hair, the lips, the nose, the figure, the closest to the white ideal is what you want to achieve. Then we see whitening processes. Physically, there is hair smoothing, there are creams. In Venezuela, it's not seen very much, but there are people who try with makeup to become a little clearer because we will be equal, certainly, but equal to a guy who is, let's say, white. In the case of my mother, I can say, for example, what happened to any woman of the 60s, the 70s, who were looking for work, were becoming independent and who lived in popular areas. They had to change their appearance, they had to change the texture of their hair, they had to apply chemicals to find employment, therefore, to place a photo where the hair was straightened and perhaps to change the address of their house because to have good presence, it was necessary to have certain characteristics, and that is to eliminate Afro-culture from aesthetic to subjective. Then there is a complete epistemicide because there is shame. what I do in my town, what my grandmother does, I don't say in the new space of work because it tends to shame. Then that idea of democracy that we all tolerate passes not by acceptance but rather by eliminating the Afro culture that is hidden under some ideals of crossbreeding that tend towards whitening.
Taking that into consideration, is the Venezuela society racist?
Yes, Venezuelan society has a hard time accepting that we are racist, and the parameter that is generally used is here we are not killing each other as in the United States, where there is separation, where there are blows, where the police really hit the populations, or African American individuals, or the Brazilian case, where there is significant spatial segregation through the favelas. That's a parameter. However, the expressions of racism in Venezuela are overlapping in institutional aspects like the one I mentioned before about access to education. Jokes. There are many jokes that I decided not to repeat, to perpetuate them, that put the black woman and man as always at disadvantage. There are institutional ways to access the spaces that are racialized, which are marked by a very particular presence that go through the supposed idea of cleanliness, good presence, etc. In education, Afro components are limited to speak about contributions from the indigenous, Afro and European, and Afro always remain in the idea of religiosity or cultural expressions associated with dance and music. Therefore, our books, long before the revolutionary process, emphasized that the Afro contribution was in music, dance and food, folklorized. Then it seems that the Afrodescendant didn't have intellectual contributions, has not contributed in the construction of the nation, which is physical presence, with its knowledge, the knowledge around the death, the health, the disease. For example, the case of the midwifery, which is an immense universe, is not recognized as an intellectual part of the contribution to the construction of the nation, but is limited to some spaces. This is expressed every day in the dynamics of the office, of the reality of the schools, the relations in the rural spaces. We can also see a discrimination of the skin that has terrible consequences in the subjectivities of Afro themselves, because it produces the worst of racism known as endoracism.
Between 2014 and 2025 is an international decade dedicated to people of African descendants. How shall the Afro-Venezuelan people seek recognition, justice, and development?
The first step is the emergence in erecting ourselves as subjects of law. Our constitution of the year 1999, characterized as one of the most progressive constitutions of the region, with which we coincide within the Afro-social movement, still have an important kernels. It ended up building the nation again as Indians and non-Indians, and we do not appear in the preamble or in the articulation of the Constitution. Therefore, the first thing to do in Venezuela is to give us the place of judges of law and recognize that culturally we are a sector other than Venezolanity, not separated from Venezolanity, but precisely part of this great diversity that forms the nation and that has to go through appearing in the constitutional preamble and build an articulated chapter that recognizes our differences in the ways of building the economic, the social, the territorial, the spirituality, and of course, its articulation with the rest of the nation, that is not a separatist idea, but rather of real inclusion, from discarding the idea of crossbreeding and entering into the logic of cultural diversity, that is, let's say, the first thing that has to happen.
Talking about this, can you name some of the most popular Afro-Venezuelan traditions and explain us how relevant to the idiosyncrasy they are? And what is your Afro-descendant legacy?
Let's think about what in terms of the political, the domestic, the spiritual, and the social political. In domestic terms, the importance of women in the family, that is one of the elements that is rebuilt in the process of slavery and cultural relocation of the populations that came first to America, is the place that the woman has to rebuild in the Afro-Venezuelan family, in weaving a unit that allows to contain individuals that are not known, that comes from different spaces, that are deprived or that are being connectively, spiritually, and she came from the motherly center idea. Rebuild the family. In Venezuela, the place of women is fundamentally that sense. Therefore, I think this is a characteristic that comes from the Afro-Venezuelan resistance, which is fundamental to understand who we are as Venezuelans and what is the place of the mother, the woman, in this fabric of sustain, of solidarity, of support both in normal moments and in critical moments. So, the motherly-centered Venezuelan society, I think, is a contribution, if we can call it like that, Venezuelan. In social terms, the Venezuelan organization is also essential. If this individual could remake their world by organizing themselves internally according to one another, that was threatening, in this case, the colonial threat, because in the Republic, things were not so simple as to be able to stop a space. Then, within the Afro-Venezuelan communities, the internal organization, fundamentally from the religious, is central. An appropriate religiosity rebuilt, with much contribution and a lot of Afro-spirituality, but obviously imbued from the Catholic, from the imposed. But what happens around the religious Afro-Venezuelan traditions not only has to do with what externally has been highlighted, which has been music, dance, the symbolic and semiotic, but what is behind, what holds there, which is the organization among the most important people of the locality, the local leaders, that in social, cultures, and religious terms, as I was saying, there was a spirituality that is very imbued of the Catholic, but that is reconstructed by taking elements of the indigenous also, but with a force placed in both the ancestral and the ancestors in a very strong way. And the last element that seems to be present in all these points that I'm telling you is solidarity. In this difficult moment that is leaving Venezuela, by the external attacks and the internal contradictions that we have, we as Venezuelans help each other in very critical moments. And I consider that the situation with slavery was one of the most terrible ones, but 300 years later, 500 years later, we are here. Therefore, solidarity is an element that also I consider to be based, that is reconstructed, that solidifies in the form like the Afro-Venezuelan communities resisted and rebuilt, having processes of resiliency to be here more than contributions in the music, in the dance. That is one of the things that is emphasized. I think there are a lot more substantial elements that are expressed here, but there are in all Venezuelans who probably do not give that remembrance in the African or Afro-descendant.
Maybe we are running out of time, but I want to ask you one last question, and so we can round up the interview. How can the Venezuelans feel proud of their Afro-Venezuelan identity?
There is a matter that we also should retake related to the account of the grandparents. And there, in those stories, we will get these leaders who could, in different ways, resist the oppression. José Leonardo Chirinos, for example, is one of the most important emblems of the Afro-social movement and of the resistance to the colonial era. But generally, these grandparents have very local stories of their own of how they solved the critical problems of their families and their own communities. Therefore, I think that the Venezuelan and the Afro-Venezuelans need to retake these stories of grandparents and ancestors and find their own trajectory to realize how valuable 500 years of construction of this country. In my case, specifically, every town has its history. I descend from 2 villages founded by free blacks, Curiepe, in the state of Miranda, which is the north of the country, and La Sabana, which is a town founded by free blacks in the coastal area. The construction stories of these 2 villages are very interesting. I took the time to study them, to review them, and find their detonators that could make me proud to belong to a culture that not only resisted, but built and produced resiliency mechanisms that we are currently implementing.
But thank you very much, Meyby, for sharing with us this time. Like this, we've come to the end of this From Caracas. In this opportunity, remember, we talked with Meyby Ugueto-Ponce, who is an anthropologist and an Afro-Venezuelan woman who investigates this rich culture that is the Afro-descendant. Thank you very much.